Hello and welcome to my presentation of the question that you see on the screen there. Why is it hard to believe in God today? We're going to answer that question by exploring the work of Charles Taylor in his book, A Secular Age. I recently just got to travel to Edinburgh, Scotland, where a lot of what we're about to talk about was represented in one city. What a history it has, especially as it relates to secularity. So the title slide is in honor of Edinburgh, Scotland. But anyway, the question, why is it hard to believe in God today? Now, to be fair, it's always been hard to believe in God, especially within Christianity. At least that's where my context that I'm coming from. The scriptures even testified to that. There is a moment in Mark chapter 9 where a dad comes to Jesus needing a kind of a healing. And he says, I believe, but help my unbelief. So it's always been hard to believe in God. But you fast forward 2,000 years here in the West, and it's harder to believe in God almost than ever before. In fact, right now, the amount of adults in the West who identify as Christian is going down. And the amount of adults in the West who identify as being religiously unaffiliated is going up. And in around 2050, 2060, they are supposed to cross. And by 2070, 55% of adults in the West are estimated to identify as being religiously unaffiliated. Now, Charles Taylor, the Catholic and Canadian philosopher and professor, he would not be surprised by these stats at all. In fact, he might argue that there is even a group of people who identify as being religiously unaffiliated and that they're being tracked regardless of their numbers going up, gives strength to his argument that today we in the West are living in a secular age. And this argument that we're going to come from or explore comes from the book that he published in 2007. And we're going to cover the answer by looking at three different conditions of belief that have changed, because that's one of the ways that Charles Taylor answers that question. His answer is essentially, well, the conditions of belief have changed. You see, Charles Taylor isn't so much worried about what people believe, but what has become believable, or even unbelievable. So we're going to look at the changing or the changes in these three conditions of belief: the cosmic, the social, and the personal. Before we begin, I want to kind of give some reference to what kind of secularity that Charles Taylor is talking about. He recognizes three types of secularity. There's a secularity that talks about the difference or the distinction between something that's religious or non-religious. And then there is a second type of secularity that's kind of the society's neutral or a-religious space. Think about public schools versus private schools. And then there's the third secularity, where religious, and this is the one that Charles Taylor is talking about in his book. This is the secularity that he talks about when he says we live in a secular age. And it is that religious belief in God is just one option among others. And at this point, it's a contested option, not the most popular one. So basically, in a secular age, not believing in God is now a valid option. And as you saw in the graph, it's becoming a less and less popular option to believe in God. So we're going to explore those three changed conditions of belief, and we're going to begin with the cosmic conditions. And to recognize kind of how things have changed, we kind of have to go back. There is what Charles Taylor calls an enchanted age. This is the age that the Bible was written in. This is the age before about 1600s when things start to change. And in this age, there was spirits and demons and moral forces. There's things like powers beyond the human mind. Even objects or things could be endowed with powers or thoughts. Think about like shrines and relics. Think about enchanted forests. Or if you ever heard the legend of King Arthur, and he had this powerful magical sword called Excalibur. And these objects, they had meanings and purposes all their own. They could bless us, and they would impinge on us. They could give or take, they could raise up or tear down. Well, the first condition that changes that Charles Taylor talks about in the cosmic world is that there's a disenchantment, that people around 14, 15, 1600s began to disenchant the world. They began to split. There were no more spirits. We began to think, well, there are no more spirits. There are no more demons. There's no more ghosts. And it wasn't so much that we as a society decided that we're not going to pay attention to cosmic things such as ghosts and spirits. It's that they were never there to begin with. And as things become disenchanted, it's not even so much that they go away, so does even the idea that they were worth believing in, or it was worth believing in them in the first place. The conditions that even made them believable started to go away. And this had several effects. One, and we'll talk about this more, but that meaning, what we kind of think as the meaning in the universe, the meaning in life, began to shift along with it. Okay, one way you might think about the pre-modern world versus or the disenchanted versus the enchanted world is in the sacraments of the Christian church or the Christian faith. Think about baptism and communion. Okay, and we're going to look at one example in Martin Luther. He was the great reformer, and in April 4th, 1507, he's doing his first mass as a monk. And this would usually be a really celebratory or festive occasion. He invited all his friends and family. But the joy of the moment was lost on Martin Luther because he felt what he called a terror of the holy. And he would go up and as a monk, he would say this prayer, and then the elements of communion or the Eucharist would change literally into the body of God. And as he held the elements up, he would be face to face with God. And this was not an exciting moment for Luther. He trembled. In fact, he froze in front of everyone. The story goes that he looked at another priest and he said, "Can I leave? Can I flee?" And the priest said, "No." And so he was able to finish. But he would later say that, "I thought to myself, with what tongue shall I address such majesty, seeing that all men ought to tremble in the presence of even earthly princes?" He felt the enchantment of the moment, the enchantment of the elements. As a pastor myself, I've led communion multiple times, but I can't really relate to Luther here. One, because I'm a Protestant and I don't practice transubstantiation, but also I'm a secular person. And in a moment like that, like leading communion, I would encourage people to think about the love and the grace of Christ, not the holy terror. And I wouldn't like Luther. He probably feared the fate of Uzzah. If you remember in 2 Samuel chapter 6, he died I think he was killed when he touched the Ark of the Covenant. Well, I'm not in those moments. I've never been scared of holding the elements. I've never seen anyone be scared of getting in like baptism's waters, because we know that it's just bread and juice. We know that the baptism waters, it's just 2 parts hydrogen and 1 part oxygen. And as a secular modern person, we would think, look, if there's anything spiritual happening here, it's not in the water or in the communion elements, it's in me. That is where things have changed as a result of disenchantment. Another thing that has changed along in the process, in the cosmic conditions, is that as this disenchantment began to mature and grow, Charles Taylor says that we began to live in what was an immanent frame, that our frame was closed off to the kind of cosmic realities, that every age lives in some kind of frame, and the enchanted age was open to the idea of things like cosmic forces and spirits, but our age now is closed, and that inside the frame, all of meaning and significance in our life is constructed without any reference to divine or supernatural. You can see in that illustration I made that all of life, even science and the moons and the stars and ordinary life, it's all within this immanent frame. It's boxed in, it's not open. This is the difference between living in a cosmic world or a universe world. In the immanent frame, you live in a universe. Everything is closed. You begin to start to see things in a natural scientific order. The world, the universe is self-sufficient. If humanity wasn't here, it would just keep on going. Whereas in a cosmos, it's open to a divine order. and you and I are dependent on the things beyond us. Why does this relate to the changed conditions of belief and answering our question as to why it's harder to believe today? Well, it began to change how people were formed in an entirely new context where God is not assumed to be a default, and meaning, the meaning of life, where you and I as human beings find meaning, it's on the move and it's moving from external to internal. Literally, this was the process of forming the modern man. Okay, now we're going to look at the social conditions, because as the world became disenchanted, the former enchantment wasn't just affecting the universe, it was even affecting the society. Whole societies could be enchanted. Charles Taylor says that to live in we're kind of go think back to the enchanted world. To live in an enchanted world was to live socially, that spiritual forces impinged on all of society. This meant that in society, your faith was not private. We live in an age now, especially in the West, where your faith is very private. People wonder about, I hope you have a good religious private life, your personal relationship with Jesus. Well, that really wasn't a thing in the enchanted world, because people lived socially, and whole communities could reap the benefits or the curses of one person. Society itself was enchanted, and its order was kept. The way things were kept into place is that everyone felt great pressure towards orthodoxy. Okay? Think about the story of Jonah. That's the illustration on the screen. Jonah was told by God to go to Nineveh, and he ran in the opposite direction. He got in a boat, and due to his disobedience, the Lord put a storm around that boat, and the boat was starting to take on water, and it was going to sink. Finally, the people asked Jonah, and he said, yes, God's mad at me. I'm the reason that for the storm. The people threw, it says that they, meaning a group of people, the society, they got Jonah and they threw him off. And as soon as he got off the boat, the seas calmed. That is an enchanted age. Nowadays, if there was a storm and you were in a boat, no one would assume that it was because maybe you made God mad. And even if you did have some kind of spiritual confession, everyone would say, well, that's fine. That's your own personal business. But not in the enchanted world. Your spirituality was affecting my society, my living almost. So, but as things began to change, we kind of moved out of that social condition and it changed into another. And here are some of the new kind of social conditions as disenchantment in that imminent frame was taking place. Number one, well, I'm sorry, we're gonna stay in that in the enchanted world and make our way. So in the enchanted world, the people had a naive experience. They lacked almost any doubt or suspicion about the reality of God. They would just go around life and believe in God. And you would see other people, and most of the time, the people around you believed the same things that you believed. But even if you didn't, you believed in something beyond. You believed something, and that created a social bond. Also, in the enchanted age, there was a famous formula that life had a hierarchy, and it was based off of the cosmic society or the cosmic order. Okay? So there was, for example, the famous formula Charles Taylor says goes like this: the clergy pray for all, the lords defend all, and the peasants labor for all. People thought that it was my calling, it was my role to have this social life. And what I do as a role affects the whole. Now, this worked for a long time, but it did have some tensions in it, and it created a growing gap between the higher vocation of life and the ordinary life. And over time, as the disenchantment happened, as the imminent frame began to build up, mostly through what Charles Taylor called reforms. These described a range of movements already underway by the late medieval period. Think about the Renaissance, the scientific revolution, Romanticism, Enlightenment, the Reformation, the Protestant Reformation. And these all were different, of course, but they all played a role in secularity growing. And all in some way, they sought to reform and renew the distorted social life. And that famous order began to crumble. And the people at top moved closer to the middle. And the peasants began closer up to the top. And it created this kind of middle place. There was what's happening, what Charles Taylor calls a disembedding. People were taking what was embedded into the world and starting to break from it. They were starting to do life, think life differently, okay, which leads to one of the beginnings of things changing, the social conditions changing now. Uh, Charles Taylor says it began with the social imaginary. And this is, you can see it on the screens, the myriads of beliefs and practices, the normative expectations and implicit assumptions that members of a society share and shape their daily lives. In other words, how societies began to think. People and whole societies began to think differently. And it had a lot of these changing conditions, these social conditions began to change as a result. And here's three of them. Number one, the society started to think of itself as an economy. The social order was leveling off, right? The top's coming down, the middle's coming up, and people began to think of working towards mutually beneficial results. There was no longer any higher power or order. Remember, we're an immanent frame, it's closed off. So there's no higher power or order that people are motivated towards. So what they're motivated towards now is each other. That was number one. Number two is that there was a public sphere that was created. It's a new concept of public opinion that developed where one where people would speak for themselves. Society was starting to decide differently. Think about the Roman Senate. Even if you don't know a lot about it, the idea essentially is that all the rulers come into one place and they discuss how the world should be run, and then they decide how the world should be run. But as secularity began to take over in the West, people began to discuss how the world should be run without the people who make those decisions present. They used to do it out in the public, and then that began to influence the decision makers. That is one of the changes, the changed conditions of social. I'm sorry, that's one of the changes in the social conditions is the public sphere. Another one that happened is what's called popular sovereignty. And the basic idea is that people began to see themselves as I can come up with the idea of what is reasonable and what is true from inside. It wasn't given to me from on high. We discovered it. Here's a great example of that. The Declaration of Independence. Shortly before the document was adopted in 1776, Thomas Jefferson wrote to Benjamin Franklin asking him for one last kind of look over or edits before it got voted in. And Benjamin Franklin, he would make one change, and you can actually Google this and see the change. He wrote that we hold these truths, and you've heard this before, we hold these truths, and the truths that we're talking about is that all men are created equal. Thomas Jefferson wrote that we hold these truths to be sacred and undeniable. But Benjamin Franklin changed them to, we hold these truths to be self-evident. From sacred and undeniable to person, inside, self-evident. In other words, Thomas Jefferson's reason for this truth was grounded in religion. It was, we believed it to be true because it was sacred. It was a truth that originated from the creator of all humans. Benjamin Franklin says, no, it's grounded in reason that we know this to be true. And not just any reason, not an outside reason, an inside reason, human reason. That is popular sovereignty. And as the West began to become disenchanted and lived in the immanent frame, all of society was changed. That's the social condition. Now, before we get to kind of the personal or individual conditions, I want to cover one thing, and you'll see why in a little bit, that Charles Taylor talks about, and it's called subtraction stories. You've heard of this, even if you don't know. It's the basic idea that society tells us that what is happening to us is natural. It was always going to happen. That once upon a time, way back then, we believed as people, we believed in spirits. But as we become rational, religion and belief withered away with science, and now there's kind of this exorcism of superstition. That the subtraction stories tell us that the separation of the supernatural and the natural was always going to happen. That we are just kind of, Charles Taylor doesn't use this word, but it almost like we've evolved naturally this way. And this is where it was always going to happen. And the scientific revolution, the Reformation, the Enlightenment, those are just things that helped us get to where we naturally were always going to get to. Charles Taylor doesn't buy it. And he says that we learned that separation, and how we learned it through secularity. And you're going to see a little bit even more of that as we go into the individual conditions or the personal conditions. This is what Taylor describes as the pre-modern self. He talks about how so we went from cosmos, like the whole world, to society, and now to the individual. He says that the individual person is what he calls buffered. The buffered self, or the modern person, sees itself as invulnerable. It's blocked off from anything, and from anything outside, and it's a master of its own meanings. As a buffered self, and you could see I kind of made an illustration, like you're not vulnerable anymore. Things can't impinge on you. All of life's meaning is around you, and all of life's meaning can kind of be found inside you, or at least you can decide it. And as a buffered modern person, belief in God includes a service to human flourishing. So if I am going to believe in God, it's going to help me flourish as a human being, because meaning has moved inside of me. Most buffered modern people are not open to the cosmic or transcendent. Think all the way back to that graph of the religious unaffiliated growing and growing and growing. Now, as a buffered self, you kind of choose your own destination, right? Well, Charles Taylor calls this the Nova effect. This is the explosion of all the options for finding meaning or significance. This proliferation of options and how to believe or not believe in God. It's so the idea is that secularity doesn't eradicate belief, but that believing in God has become one of the many options for having a good life, which Charles Taylor calls fullness. That the human impulse to find significance, meaning, or value is fullness. You might even say that Taylor's entire work is pretty much saying all humans throughout time have been trying to figure out how to find fullness. Well, in the secular age, we find it within the immanent frame. We find it within ourselves. Secularity has eliminated, what Charles Taylor finds out, what he concludes to, and this takes us back to the the subtraction stories, is that despite where we've been, and despite some people or the subtraction stories saying this was always going to happen, it's natural, Charles Taylor says secularity has not eliminated the pursuit for fullness. Rather, the difference lies in where to find that fullness. The modern buffered person is open to the idea of fullness and peace, but the ordination on where to find it is pointed inward. And due to the Nova effect, the options to choose from in searching for that fullness has multiplied within a range of possibilities, and sometimes those possibilities are even competing. I'm going to give you an example of that. Take the Protestant paganism example from Andrew Wilson in his book, Remaking the World. He is an author and a theologian in the UK. And he comes up with, he's looking at the secular age or world, and he's looking at Americanism especially, and he comes up with the term Protestant pagan. And this is kind of one of the effects of the Nova effect and the buffered person trying to find themselves. It's basically the idea of taking modern paganism and modern Protestantism, and pushing them together. So modern paganism includes this kind of wide, tolerant view of spirituality. So not a lot of like doctrinal theology, kind of anything goes, along with an immanent source of meaning. And then so that's paganism. And then you take Protestantism, which comes with this kind of spirit of religious subjectivity, a private religious life. It comes with disenchantment, and it comes with prioritizing skepticism. Protestantism is, at least in the beginning, was kind of skeptical of anything super religious or why are you doing that kind of thing. You merge those two things together and you get what Andrew Wilson says combines a very broad menu of spiritual practice and experiences with a very narrow range of dogmatic commitments. So while nobody might say, I'm a Protestant pagan, in the secular world, they're all over the place. For example, Protestant pagans, they believe in spirituality, but they don't go to church. No one needs to tell them how to be spiritual. They trust emotions, but not establishments. They are theologically just about anything goes, but they have very strict social conditions, and they're very deeply convicted by some social justice, for example, all of which they have matching Bible verses for. And if you step outside those non-confessional boundaries, you will kind of get kicked out and told to repent. That's Protestant paganism. It might sound strange and even inconceivable. It won't show up in any statistics, but it's very real. And it is an example of the explosion of those beliefs or the options. Of course, one other thing that Charles Taylor points to is that this explosion of options gives the buffered self more options that it can actually handle. And what's ironic is that in a pursuit for fullness, the buffered self ends up being cross-pressured with all of these options. There's this open space where you can kind of choose your own adventure, but it actually creates a force where everything is pulling from some direction, and it actually generates a spiritual predicament, leaving the person not at peace, but on edge, not at ease. This age that we're in right now, there's all kinds of different ages. As he tracks it, where he kind of gets to the cross pressure point. Our current age is called the age of authenticity. That's the age within an age that we're in. So we're in the secular age, but within that, we're even inside the age of authenticity. And you can see that it's the age of authenticity can be identified in a couple ways. One, it's rooted in like 17th century romanticism, that the modern self today has his or her own way of realizing their humanity. They do a lot of looking within, and that it is important to find, live out one's own life. I don't want anyone to tell me how to do it. I want to have a life or choosing life that's authentic to what I want. The immanent frame is closed off, and the buffered self looks within. A good example of that is the Disney princesses. I think the Disney princesses, they do a good job of speaking for a modern secular person. I have three daughters, all young, so I'm very familiar with all the Disney princesses. Beauty and the Beast, Belle from Beauty and the Beast, she sings a song, and she says, "I want so much more than they've got planned." If you remember, it opens up with this kind of early 15th, 16th century social world. And she looks around and she's like, I don't want that. I want to discover it all for myself. I've got way more than they, society, age of authenticity, we're looking inside than they've got planned. And then Mulan, in her movie, she has a song where she's looking at her reflection. And she says, I won't pretend that I'm someone else for all time. When will my reflection show who I am inside? Her tension is that, man, there's someone in here. There's some truth, meaningfulness in here. I just got to find it. Who is it that I am inside? And Taylor sees in the age of authenticity, and I think he's right. Think about that graph we saw at the beginning, that he sees in the age of authenticity, in the secular age, it's this momentum or this retreat out of Christendom. Which takes us to our last point. I want to end with kind of a pastoral plea, or I want to end with a minister's perspective. I am a minister and I do a lot of work with other ministers. How can we, as ministers, take heed in a secular age? How can we survive and thrive and do ministry in a secular age? And I'm getting that taking heed language from a guy that I really like, an old Puritan pastor from the 1600s called Richard Baxter. He wrote a book called The Reformed Pastor because he felt like the pastors around him were not doing a very good job in ministry. He thought that they were, you see, he thought they were lazy, materialistic, and they were neglecting their own spiritual lives. He wasn't fighting unbelief yet, but he was fighting what sounds an awful like what Taylor would eventually call Christian nominalism. So even though Richard Baxter didn't know it, I think that he was talking to a lot of pastors who were beginning to feel the beginnings of secularity. And he says, take heed. And so I've got some of my own, some of them from Richard Baxter, ways that we can take heed as ministers in a secular age. Number one, take heed not to be tempted by unbelief. If we are not careful, if we don't always abide in Christ, our default setting will not run towards him, it'll run away from transcendent. The default secular person runs away from the transcendent, and it engages with that nova effect, all those options, lest you be tempted. A new temptation, I think, for a secular person is unbelief. It's not a different faith or even being bad at your current faith, although those always remain true. But now unbelief, not believing in God at all, is now a temptation that we feel. So take heed not to be tempted by it. Take heed to stay humble, lest you succumb to arrogance. Listen to what Tim Keller said, someone who dealt with a lot of secularity in New York in his ministry. He said, today, he says, sorry, I got to pull up my notes. He says, he says that it is an embarrassment now to be merely faithful and not successful. That it's an embarrassment now if you are merely faithful and not successful. And he's saying, please, in the secular age, it is so important to rise to the top. Yes, we lopped off the top religious, but now we have a new top. Money, materialism, job, performance. And he's saying that the secular age comes with a certain kind of arrogance. Stay humble. We're not trying to fight our way over people. Jesus actually calls us to be servants. He flips the secular hierarchy. He says, great are among you is the one who is the slave, is the servant. So take heed and stay humble. Take heed to never grow tired of personal testimonies. I think personal testimonies of coming to faith in Jesus Christ do a good job of pushing against those subtraction stories that we read about earlier. It's people who were in the buffered self. They were exploring the nova effect. They were looking from within, and they found Christ, and they found a meaning, a purpose outside of themselves in the Messiah. Don't grow tired of personal testimonies. Keep hearing them, keep sharing them, keep telling them to fight against the subtraction stories. Lastly, take heed to engage with the enchanted. Charles Taylor says that even with the imminent frame, he offers hope. He says it's possible to live in an imminent frame and live in an imminent frame that is open to something beyond. And that within the transcendence, we can find the answer to our deepest craving. So ministers, I would encourage you to meditate and ponder on the mysteries of our faith, like the sacraments, like the spiritual gifts, like the healing power of the Holy Spirit, and never stop expecting God to move. And then lastly, we should preach the gospel to ourselves. Take heed to preach the gospel to others and always to yourself, lest you be void of the saving grace of God, which you offer to others, and be strangers to the effectual working of that gospel which you preach. That's Richard Baxter in the 1600s. The good news of Jesus Christ is fresh and accessible in every single age. Our wisdom is not, 1 Corinthians chapter 2, our meaning is not found in the wisdom of this age or the rulers of this age, which are doomed to pass away. Instead, Christ, so his last word says, I will be with you always to the end of the age. That includes the secular age. So, why is it hard to believe in God today? Because of all the changes in the conditions of belief. The cosmic ones, like disenchantment and the imminent frame. The social ones, like economy, the public sphere, popular sovereignty, and the individual personal ones. We've become buffered. We feel the effects of the nova effect, the nova explosion. We're cross-pressured. In other words, let me pull up my notes so I get this right. In other words, belief is harder today because believing in God exists as one option among many. And increasingly, it is an unpopular option, one that is difficult to sustain, goes against the cultural grain, and lives side by side alongside with an unimaginable alternative to an unimaginable number of alternative belief. The secular age is all about many, many, many options. The good news is, as ministers of the gospel and believers in Jesus Christ, we know where that fullness is. We know where meaning is. It's in the person and the work of Jesus Christ. Thank you.